Russian Identity in Putin's Russian History Lessons. Textbooks as a Case Study. We've explored the idea of the Russian idea and what it might consist of during the Yeltsin years. Yeltsin, in 1996, held a competition with a 10 million ruble prize to articulate a new Russian idea, but one wasn't found, and Pelevin's Homo sapiens reveals this in its brilliant satire. Galina Starovotova, a politician assassinated in 1998, I think summed up one of the reasons why finding out what the Russian idea might consist of was so problematic when she said the solution is not building an official idea, but in continuing to build a civil society that will generate its own ideas. And we've looked at this problem of the creation of a civil society and the overbearing state preventing the civil society to have the oxygen that it is needed to be able to grow, become more visible and more vocal. And I think Frank Hart, an Irish songwriter and singer, sort of sums up this problem of the formal and informal Russian ideas that are percolating at this time when he said, "Those in power write the history, while those who suffer write the songs." And so there's been this sort of distinction between the state culture, the official policy, the official Russian idea, versus what is said or sung in the kitchens. Textbooks are a really interesting way to see what that official idea is, and textbooks have been critical in forming or informing young minds for generations, and it's certainly not merely academic. And it raises a host of questions. What is the purpose of history in public schools? Who gets to decide? What is the function of history as it's taught in public schools throughout the young years of 5- and 6-year-olds onwards into teenage years? It's patriotism, citizenship, critical thinking, indoctrination. Who gets to decide the curriculum? Who gets to frame the narrative or tell the story? Whose story is told, and for what purpose? And where do historians fit into this picture of creating a meaningful history for the next generation? How do students process this information that they're given? And what do they learn? What should they be learning? Increasingly, this debate on textbooks is something that is found throughout the world, and it's fascinating, and I work with this idea in my historiography class. And there is the official sort of state idea of what history should do, history should teach, and then there are what historians advocate what history should do. And for states, it comes down to the celebration typically of guns and God and country as sort of the standard for national histories throughout the world. And I urge you to look at these sort of global debates going on. They're absolutely fascinating. But we're going to look at the Soviet and Russian example of what happens with informing the young minds, and not so young minds, through textbooks. States try to create a master narrative that will help celebrate their past and help legitimize their rule. A good example of that is the Soviet socialist narrative that is found in the short course on the history of the All-Union Communist Party Bolshevik. And it was the standard party line textbook or meta-guide that came out in 1938 and revised as politics demanded. And overall sort of the overarching narrative of this story was the triumph of Marxist socialism over capitalism. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the so-called failure of Soviet socialism, it was required to then reframe this master narrative, and questions arose of what to do with it. What did the Soviet past mean? Did you simply remove it? Do you reframe it? What replaces it? And so this gets to the whole question of what will be the new Russian idea. The Soviet idea has become meaningless, discarded, delegitimized. And the Gorbachev years, I think, illustrate this very well with the glasnost period where citizens began to uncover the past. Where there was previously silence, there are now voices, and this what is called the return of history. The blank spots are being recovered of what happened and what happened to loved ones during this time of silence. And it got to the point where nobody really knew what the truth was, that in 1988 history exams were canceled because what was history? And it raises a question which I find fascinating. Again, I work with in my historiography class quite a bit of what one of the purposes of history is really to help us find meaning in our life. And so we all search for history, whether it's a personal history, a family history, or a broader history that we can use in our lives. And so what history is usable? And I think we've seen this already in our readings of trying to figure out what the past really is and how we can use this past to understand the present. So all these questions of what is to be done with the past. Do you reject the past? Do you try to rehabilitate the past? Do you retool the past? What past will be recovered and how will you use the recovered past? Are all questions that arise after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the fluid 90s continues to search and try to find out what history should be used. And one of the big issues, as we've seen with our readings, is the rise of new nationalities and a plurality of histories and identities at this time, and the lack of consensus of this time. And I actually believe that a lack of consensus in the understanding of history is a positive thing. You don't want to have one story that explains everything. Consensus leads to conformity and a dulling of the dynamic and conversation of history. In the 1990s, textbooks, and I've listed several of them here, turned to the reconsideration of socialism and revolution. What was socialism? What was Soviet socialism? What was the meaning of revolution, and particularly the revolution of 1917? And was it legitimate? And how to make sense of it all. And it was very complicated and confusing. And with this complication and confusing sort of context of it all, Putin then calls for a master narrative to simplify things, because authoritarians tend to like to have a simple narrative that can legitimize their rule. In 2003, Putin calls on the Russian Academy of Science to examine all these history textbooks that have come before and to examine them for how healthy and celebratory they are. And he claims this is necessary because the World War II vets were complaining on how the war was being depicted and how they were being depicted. And this was purely a pretext to be able to create a new master narrative guided by the state. 2004, the Ministry of Education argued that there would be no pseudo-liberalism aimed at misinterpreting our history, which I think pretty much says it all. Then in 2007, a critical year for the creation of a new master narrative in history, the Russian Academy of Education overhauls the teachers' manuals for the social studies with a volume called The History of Russia, 1945-2006. There's only one professional historian on this writing team to create this teacher's manual on how to teach history. And its purpose essentially was to create a national patriotic ideology, and this was headed by a non-historian, A.V. Filipov. 2013, Putin declared the need for a unified history textbook to deal with regional histories to help students and teachers to deal with the past, because there was just too much choice. It was just too confusing when there were all these options and there was this sort of complicated analysis of what it all meant. I think Winston S. Churchill summed this up when he said, "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." And I think this letter fits for Putin. And in one of your readings, I think the author sort of sums up, Andrei Kolesnikov, the role of the state and history oftentimes, official forms of collective memory keep history within the framework of the state's understanding. These forms are used to control society and define national rituals and other ways the state memorializes the past. School textbooks, for example, play a decisive role in official views of history. So here we see just another example of stripping away any sort of democratic advancement by creating a homogeneous sort of orthodoxy of what the past will be, not only for Russians, but also how the different non-Russians have a history in the Soviet Union. And most of the public actually were willing to accept this, in part because this information overload that happened from the Gorbachev years onward. There was so much information and trying to make sense of it. And some of it they didn't even want to know. It was humiliating to find out sort of the crimes of the past. So the public desired uniformity in textbooks. They believe overall that the state should determine the context, and conformity and consensus was desired overall, which is really the opposite of what historians desire when they begin to look at the past and its meaning. The public in general believed that standardization was necessary and that a simplified, seamless tell benefited society, and of course the state agreed with this idea of a simplified, seamless tell of positive stories about the past that would uplift the society and also make the state look good. And so overall, people like what Zubkova called grandmother's history. Grandmother's history are those stories that are fun. They usually tell a good story. Grandma could tell a good story, right? And the goal is to form a more positive attitude. They were going to be good, positive, moral stories, because contradictions and ambiguities are confusing and not necessarily attractive in one's past, whether personal or social. And Putin points to foreigners as one of the culprits of creating this confusing and false history. And so points to the falsification of the past in foreigners. And again, uses World War II as the focus. And your readings talk about why World War II is such a focus in this debate on what the past should look like. In 2007, Putin argues that it's foreigners that are creating these negative images that are sort of seeping into textbooks, in part because foreigners are paying for these textbooks, as he says. Many school books are written by people who work for foreign grants. They dance to the polka that others have paid for. There is a presidential commission in 2009 that looks at so-called cases of falsification of historical facts. And essentially these cases, they probably are not falsified, but they are deemed as harmful to Russian national interests and hence must be stripped from textbooks. And it's particularly aimed at the presentation of the acts of the Soviet Union or Russia as an aggressor, particularly in World War II. Vladimir Yakunin sums up, I think, the state line on textbooks when he argued, if we don't create our own textbook, our children will study books written with Soros's money that contain only 2 paragraphs about the role of the USSR in World War II and 2 pages about the contribution of the Western coalition. So clearly, Russia does not want its textbooks written by Western foreigners. We all want a usable past. We all want a past that we find meaningful and does help uplift us. And so one of those big challenges was to figure out how the Soviet experience fit into this new world, and to try to explain it so that it was not an aberration, it was not a crime, it was not a mistake. Also addressing how to make sense of Stalin was a huge issue, and you can read in your essays on how Stalin makes a huge comeback. And in part, the Great Patriotic War frames this narrative, and Stalin then comes out as seen as sort of the hero of the war. I guess one thing to think about is Is this a bad thing? Patriotism is stressed. Is it bad? And what to do about history?